One night in 1946, a 300-member criminal network set fire to a packed Harlem jazz club with 237 people inside. They had paid off the police, planned every detail, and believed nothing could stop them. They had never met Bumpy Johnson. What did one man do in 72 hours that made an entire criminal empire never touch Harlem again? To understand how it all led here, we go back to where it truly began. This was not a fire. That is the first thing you need to understand before anything else. What happened at the Lennox Lounge on the night of March 14, 1946 was not a fire. It was not faulty wiring. It was not a kitchen accident or a knocked-over candle or any of the other comfortable explanations that appeared on page 14 of the next morning's white newspapers. It was a massacre, planned across 6 weeks, funded, rehearsed, executed by men who had done this kind of work before and walked away clean every single time. 237 people were inside that building, dancing, laughing, living, and every single one of them was meant to die before midnight. And the man who gave that order, that same morning, he had stood in a receiving line on Fifth Avenue, shaken the mayor's hand with a firm grip and a broad smile, and written a personal check for $2,000 to a children's hospital fund, while photographers captured the moment for the society pages. His suit had not a single crease out of place. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. By the time he drove home that evening and made one quiet telephone call, 237 people had been marked for death, and the city's most beloved jazz club had been turned into a trap. This is the story that never made page one, not in the papers that mattered to the people who ran this city, but in Harlem. They knew. They always knew. And 70 years later, the truth is still there, in the oral history passed from grandparents to grandchildren, in the FBI files declassified long after the men involved had died with their secrets mostly intact, in the memory of a neighborhood that watched one man stand between a calculated act of destruction and 237 lives, and refused to move. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand what Harlem was in the winter of 1946. Not the Harlem of the travel magazines, not the romantic version that white New Yorkers like to visit on weekend evenings before taking the subway safely back downtown. The real Harlem, the one that existed underneath all of that. The war had ended less than a year earlier, and from the ports of New York, tens of thousands of black veterans were stepping off troop ships and back onto American soil. These were not the same men who had left. They had crossed the Atlantic and fought their way through campaigns that history books would later call decisive turning points. They had buried friends in the soil of France and Germany. They had stared down the machinery of fascism and held their positions. In Paris, French civilians had pressed food and wine into their hands and called them liberators. In the villages of Normandy, children had climbed onto the sides of their trucks and cheered. For the first time in their lives, many of these men had moved through a world that responded to them as full human beings, not as a category, not as a problem to be contained, but simply as men who had earned respect through sacrifice and courage. And then the ships brought them home to America. The signs were always there from the first 100 yards off the gangway. A water fountain with a handwritten label, a waiting room divided by a rope, a ticket window with 2 lines, an entire invisible architecture that had been waiting patiently for their return, unchanged, unmoved, utterly indifferent to everything they had survived and everything they had proven. Men who had commanded platoons under artillery fire came home to find their loan applications declined. Men who had navigated aircraft through anti-aircraft clouds came home to discover that certain neighborhoods did not sell to certain buyers, regardless of what those buyers could afford. Men who had been celebrated in European newspapers came home to find their own newspapers had them on page 14, if they appeared at all. But something fundamental had shifted inside these men, and the people who ran this city could feel it. These veterans had learned things in Europe that could not be unlearned. They had learned that the system of control they had grown up accepting was not a natural law. It was a choice, deliberate, maintained, enforced by institutions and habits, and the quiet threat of consequence. And choices, they now understood with absolute clarity, could be resisted. Harlem in 1946 was tens of thousands of these men living within walking distance of each other, sharing a neighborhood that had been squeezed and neglected for decades, connected by a common understanding that was hardening by the month into something that made the people in the tall buildings downtown deeply uncomfortable. It was not a neighborhood anymore. It was a force waiting for direction. And the most dangerous thing in that city, more dangerous than any single act of resistance, was someone who could give that force a shape. That was what Bumpy Johnson represented. And that was what made him a target. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, Bumpy to everyone who knew him, which was everyone in Harlem, was 40 years old in the winter of 1946, and he carried those years in a way that made him seem both older and more vital than men half his age. He was not physically imposing in the way that fear sometimes required. He was medium height, lean, with hands that looked like they belonged to a carpenter or a pianist rather than a man who had spent decades at the center of Harlem's underground economy. What struck people who met him for the first time was not his size, but his stillness. He moved through rooms the way a chess player moves through a problem with complete attention, no wasted motion, and the quiet confidence of someone who has already considered the outcomes that other people haven't noticed yet. He had read more books than most college graduates. He could quote Frederick Douglass and Niccolò Machiavelli in the same conversation and mean both of them with equal sincerity. He understood power, who had it, how it was maintained, where its edges were, and what happened to people who pushed against those edges without a strategy. He had pushed against plenty of edges himself over the years, and the fact that he was still standing, still free, still operating, was not luck. It was the product of a mind that treated every situation as information and every adversary as a problem to be understood before it could be solved. The Lennox Lounge was his statement to the world, not written in words but built in steel and lumber, and $40,000 in cash that he had placed on the table without apology. He had not built it to become wealthy. He had built it because Harlem deserved something that belonged entirely to itself. The musicians who played the Lennox were paid double the standard rate, because Bumpy believed that talent of that quality was being systematically undervalued by an industry that profited from it while refusing to honor it. Every member of the staff, bartenders, waiters, kitchen workers, the woman who ran the coat check with an efficiency that put most office managers to shame, was from the neighborhood. The prices were set at a level that a factory worker or a domestic employee could afford on a Friday night without choosing between the music and the rent. The money that came in stayed in the community, by design, because Bumpy had thought carefully about what he was building and what it was supposed to accomplish. Duke Ellington had performed on that stage. Billie Holiday had stood at that microphone and delivered performances that left the audience in a silence so complete it felt like reverence. Charlie Parker had played there on nights when the music seemed to exist outside of ordinary time entirely. The Lennox was not simply a place to spend an evening. It was the physical proof that Harlem could build something world-class, something beautiful, something that competed with anything downtown on pure merit, and that the community itself, not an outside investor, not a white-owned entertainment company, was the author of that achievement. For 2 years it had stood as evidence that black independence was not a dream or a political slogan, but a living, functioning reality that paid its taxes and kept its floors polished, and turned away. No one who came through the door with enough for a cover charge. That was precisely the problem. Not for everyone, but for the kind of man who understood that the most dangerous threat to a system of control is not a protest, but a proof of concept. His name in the organization was Warden Cross, and almost no one outside that organization knew his real name, which was exactly the way he had designed it. He had moved to New York from Georgia in 1938, one step ahead of a federal inquiry that was beginning to connect a series of church burnings across 3 counties to a single organizing intelligence. He had arrived in the North with money, contacts, and a philosophy that he had spent years refining into something he considered elegant. The old methods were obsolete. Public spectacle attracted cameras and prosecutors and the kind of national attention that made politicians nervous. What was needed was not visibility, but penetration members inside institutions, inside police precincts and union halls and city contracting offices. People who could protect the network from the inside while the network worked from the outside. By 1946, he had built exactly that. 300 members across New York City. Carefully vetted, strategically placed. Police officers who knew when to look the other direction. Union leaders who controlled access to certain job sites. A city councilman who owed a favor that could never be repaid publicly. From the outside, Cross was a successful hardware store owner, a civic contributor, a man with a firm handshake and a reputation for reliability. From the inside, he was the architect of a system whose entire purpose was the quiet, deniable destruction of black economic independence, targeting not protesters, but builders. Not the loudest voices, but the most productive ones, eliminating them through accidents and misfortunes that left no signature and produced no martyrs. For 6 weeks before March 14th, his people had studied the Lennox lounge with the thoroughness of engineers. They mapped the building's layout, identified structural vulnerabilities, calculated the ventilation patterns that would determine how quickly smoke would fill the interior. They identified the Thursday evening late set as the optimal window maximum occupancy. Music loud enough to cover the sound of preparation outside. A neighborhood police patrol that had been quietly adjusted by someone 2 levels up the chain who owed Cross a debt of a particular kind. They had planned for the fire department's response time. They had planned for the crowd's panic. They had planned for the exits. They had planned for everything. Everything except the one variable that their meticulous 6 weeks of preparation had somehow failed to account for. Bumpy Johnson was on the 2nd floor balcony that night. He was always on the 2nd floor balcony on Thursday evenings. It was where he went to watch what he had built, not with the satisfaction of possession, but with something closer to wonder. Below him, the dance floor moved like a single living thing. The Count Basie Orchestra was midway through their 2nd set, the brass section climbing toward something extraordinary. And Bumpy sat with Illinois Gordon across from him and watched his community celebrate itself. And he thought this is what it was for. This moment, this joy, this exact proof that we are capable of building something that no one can take from us. 8 minutes after 11 o'clock in the evening, 3 points of the building ignited simultaneously. The first smell was smoke, not the familiar smoke of cigarettes or kitchen grease, but something thicker, blacker, chemical in a way that registered in the body before the mind could process it. Then the screaming started from the back of the building near the service corridor, where a woman had turned and seen the wall behind her already moving with flame. The music faltered and stopped. For one suspended second, 237 people stood completely still. The way animals go still when they sense something has changed in the environment and the nature of that change has not yet resolved itself into something nameable. Then the panic broke. The crowd surged toward the front entrance simultaneously. 237 people compressing into a space designed to release them, 1 or 2 at a time. And the mathematics of it were immediately catastrophic. People went down. Others fell over them. The screaming became something else entirely. Not fear, but the specific terror of people who understand that the danger is no longer only the fire. On the 2nd floor balcony, Bumpy was already moving before the surge began. already calculating what he was seeing, already 3 steps ahead of the situation, the way he was always 3 steps ahead of every situation that had kept him alive this long. He came down the stairs at full speed, his old knee injury registering a protest that he filed and ignored in the same instant. He pushed through to the center of the room, climbed onto the nearest table, and raised his weapon toward the ceiling. The single shot cut through everything, through the screaming, through the panic, through the roar of fire that was now audible from the rear of the building. 237 people froze in a silence so sudden it felt like the world had lurched off its axis. Bumpy's voice, when it came, was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the voice of a man who understood that panic kills faster than fire, and that the only thing standing between this room and complete catastrophe was the next 30 seconds of absolute clarity. Nobody dies tonight. He let those 3 words sit in the air for exactly 1 beat. But from this second forward, you listen to me. It was not a request. It was not encouragement. It was a statement of fact, delivered by a man who had already decided it was true and was simply informing everyone else of the situation they were now in. And something shifted in that room. Not calm. There was no calm. The back wall was fully engaged and the heat was becoming a physical presence but order. The difference between 237 people dying together and 237 people surviving together. Bumpy directed the flow with the precision of someone who had memorized every exit, every hallway, every structural feature of a building he had spent $40,000 constructing and 2 years occupying. Illinois took the left side. The staff, who had been trained for emergencies, moved to the edges of the crowd and created corridors. The strong helped the weak without being told. The musicians moved as a unit. The kitchen staff cleared the service route, and Bumpy stood at the center of all of it, directing, counting, watching. Then he turned and ran back into the smoke. The bathroom corridor was black with it, the kind of darkness that has weight and texture. He found the men's room by memory, got 3 people out, pushed them toward the front, turned around and went back. The women's bathroom door had warped from the heat and refused to open. He kicked it once, twice, and on the 3rd kick, the frame gave way. 2 people inside Marie, the attendant who had worked the Lennox since opening night, and a young woman who had pressed herself into the corner and was no longer responding to her own name. Bumpy did not have time for gentleness. He gathered the young woman in his arms, grabbed Marie's hand, and moved. The rear wall came down behind them with a sound like the building exhaling its last breath. He came through the front entrance, and the fresh air hit him like a wall. Illinois caught him before his legs gave out entirely. He lowered the young woman to the pavement as carefully as his failing muscles allowed and doubled over, coughing from somewhere so deep in his chest that each convulsion tasted of copper and ash. Count. The word came out between coughs, barely recognizable as language. How many made it out? Illinois was already moving through the crowd, checking faces, running numbers against a mental list built from years of knowing exactly who was in a room at any given moment. Bumpy stayed on one knee on the sidewalk, each breath a separate act of will, and waited. 2:37. Illinois came back to him, and for a moment his voice carried something that was not quite disbelief. Bumpy. Every single one. Bumpy raised his head and looked back at the Lennox lounge. The entire structure was engulfed now, flames pushing through every window, the roof beginning its slow collapse inward. 2 years of work. $40,000. Every musician who had ever played that stage and made the air in that room feel like it belonged to something larger than ordinary life. All of it burning. And then, across the street, through the wavering heat and the gathering crowd, and the smoke that rolled down Lennox Avenue like a living thing. He saw them. 3 figures standing in the shadow of a building entrance, watching. Still, the posture of men who had come to observe the result of their work. One of them, the one in the center, slightly forward of the others, was smiling, not laughing, not celebrating, just smiling, the quiet, satisfied smile of a man who believes he has just sent a message that will not require repeating. The pain in Bumpy's chest disappeared, not because it had stopped, but because something else had replaced it entirely. He committed that face to memory the way a man commits a debt, completely, permanently, without any possibility of forgetting. All 237 people got out that night. Not one life was lost. But the men who had planned this massacre were still standing across the street in the dark. And one of them was smiling. And Bumpy Johnson on his knees on the pavement. Lungs burning, tasting his own blood, had just made a decision that would define the next 72 hours in ways that Warden Cross, in all his 6 weeks of meticulous planning, had never once considered possible. Illinois came back to the sidewalk with a man who was not one of the 3 watchers. He was younger than expected. 28, maybe 30, with the kind of face that belongs to someone who made a decision they cannot undo and has been living inside that decision for the past 2 hours. His hands were shaking, and on his hands, on the creases of his knuckles and beneath his fingernails, was the unmistakable smell of accelerant, sharp and chemical and honest in a way that no explanation could cover. Bumpy was still on one knee on the pavement when Illinois dragged the man forward. Every breath was a separate negotiation with his own body. The doctor would later use phrases like severe smoke inhalation and possible permanent lung damage. And Bumpy would listen to all of it with the patience of a man filing information he has no intention of acting on. But that was still hours away. Right now there was this man in front of him, with gasoline on his hands and fear in his eyes. And Bumpy understood immediately that fear like this was not an obstacle. It was a tool. He looked at the man for a long moment without speaking. Just looked. Taking inventory the way he always took inventory, not of what a person said, but of what their body was saying underneath the words. The micro-expressions and the posture and the specific quality of the silence a person produces when they are deciding how afraid to be. "Get him to the warehouse on Brook Avenue," Bumpy said, his voice reduced to something low and rough by the smoke still burning in his chest. "I'll be there in an hour." The warehouse was dark except for a single work lamp on a folding table, and the shadows it threw made the space feel smaller than it was, more enclosed, more deliberate. Bumpy sat across from the man and studied him the way a surgeon studies a chart before making the first incision. The man's name was David Miller. He had needed money. His wife was ill. Someone had offered him $500 and a simple set of instructions, and he had told himself, the way desperate people always tell themselves, that the specifics were someone else's problem. Cross had calculated that Miller would stay silent out of fear. It was a reasonable calculation based on the way most people respond to threats, that the danger in front of them always outweighs the danger they are imagining. But Cross had never watched Bumpy Johnson conduct a conversation, and so he had no way of knowing that Bumpy's particular genius was the ability to make a person feel that the silence they were protecting was the most dangerous place they could possibly stand. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward or change the expression on his face or do any of the things that intimidation usually looks like from the outside. He simply asked questions, quiet, specific, patient questions that moved in a direction Miller could not quite see until he was already inside it, until the answers he was giving were filling in a map he had not consciously agreed to draw. 40 minutes. That was all it took. Not because Miller was weak, but because Bumpy was that good at finding the exact angle at which a person's resistance becomes more exhausting than the truth. By the time Miller said the name, the warden Bumpy had already assembled most of the picture. The name confirmed the frame. He gave Miller $50, a bus ticket, and a single instruction that was delivered in the same quiet tone as everything else, and therefore landed with the weight of a verdict rather than a warning. Miller left the warehouse before midnight and was on a bus out of New York before the sun came up. And Bumpy never thought about him again. What happened next was something that Cross, in all his careful planning, had also failed to anticipate: a man with severe lung damage and a doctor's strict instructions to rest for several weeks lay down in his bed in Harlem, opened a notepad, and went to work. The private doctor came and went. He left medication, a list of prohibitions, and the kind of expression that medical professionals develop when they understand their advice will not be followed. Bumpy absorbed the information about his own body with clinical detachment, allocated 3 days against the doctor's recommendation of several weeks, and turned his attention to the problem in front of him. From a single name and a single address, he began to reconstruct the architecture of Cross's network, the way an archaeologist reconstructs a civilization from fragments by understanding how systems work, what they require to function, where the load-bearing elements must be, and what the connections between visible pieces imply about the invisible ones. He knew how power organized itself in this city. He had spent 20 years studying it from the inside, from the outside, from every angle that survival had required him to master. He knew which institutions attracted a certain kind of ambition. He knew which debts created which alliances. He knew that a network of 300 people embedded across police, government, and organized labor did not maintain itself through ideology alone, but through mutual obligation, everyone holding something on everyone else. The whole structure held together by the shared understanding that exposure was equally dangerous for all parties. He filled 3 pages of notes in handwriting that grew steadily less steady as the hours passed, and the pain medication wore off. And he did not stop until the picture was complete enough to act on. While Bumpy worked in silence in a darkened bedroom, the city was having 2 completely different conversations about what had happened at the Lennox lounge. The New York Times ran 11 words on page 14 and moved on by the weekend. The Amsterdam News, Harlem's paper, ran the photograph on page 1. Bumpy carrying the young woman through the smoke, his face set like concrete, and beneath it, a headline that named the organization responsible without qualification or euphemism. The article detailed the arson with the specificity of eyewitnesses. It quoted Marie, the bathroom attendant whose life Bumpy had carried out of a burning building. Mr. Johnson ran back in twice, while everyone else was running out. Whoever tried to do this to us, they better pray the police find them before he does. Bumpy read both papers from his bed and understood immediately that 2 battles were now running simultaneously on parallel tracks. One was the investigation, the official story, the page 14 version, the accidental fire narrative that the system had already decided on before the ashes were cold. The other was the public record, the Amsterdam News, the oral networks of Harlem, the story that 237 survivors were already telling to everyone who would listen. He could not control the first, but the second was already running in his favor, and he understood its value. Every person in Harlem who read that front page was now watching, and people who are watching hold power accountable in ways that darkness cannot. He told Illinois, "Let them know I'm looking. Don't say anything else. Just let them know." By Saturday evening, all of Harlem knew 3 things. The organization had tried to commit mass destruction. Bumpy Johnson had saved 237 lives, and Bumpy was hunting the people responsible. That information moved through the neighborhood the way information always moves in communities that have learned to communicate through channels the powerful cannot monitor through barbershops and church steps and the spaces between words in ordinary conversation. It reached people Cross had placed inside Harlem's institutions, and some of those people began to make quiet calculations about the nature of loyalty and the cost of being on the wrong side of a story that was already being written. Illinois Gordon had many qualities, but the one that made him irreplaceable was this: he could disappear. Not in the dramatic sense, not in the way that drew attention by its effort, but in the ordinary sense of a man who understands how to be present in a space without registering as a presence. He could sit in a parked car across from a warehouse in Queens for 90 minutes without moving, without checking his watch, without doing anything that marked him as someone who was observing rather than simply existing in the vicinity. It was a talent Bumpy had recognized years earlier and never taken for granted. The warehouse in Astoria was exactly what Miller had described. Unremarkable from the outside. A light visible through one high window. 7 cars parked at intervals that suggested they had arrived separately, at different times. With the practiced casualness of people who had been meeting this way for years. The men who got out of those cars were not the type the newspapers drew when they illustrated stories about organized hatred. They wore good suits. They carried themselves with the ease of men who owned things property. Influence, the kind of social capital that makes certain people invisible to scrutiny. They greeted each other with handshakes that were brief and firm, and told Illinois everything he needed to know about hierarchy, who waited and who was waited for, who spoke first and who listened. Then the black Cadillac arrived. It was new. The kind of new that announces itself quietly, not flashy, but deliberately, specifically expensive in a way that communicated permanence rather than display. The man who stepped out was in his mid-40s, wearing a gray fedora and a suit that cost more than most Harlem families spent on clothing in a year. He moved across the parking lot with the particular gait of a man who has spent so long being the most important person in every room he enters that he no longer thinks about it. The others adjusted their posture when they saw him. Small adjustments, barely perceptible. But Illinois saw them all. 90 minutes later. The meeting ended and the cars left one by one. Illinois followed the Cadillac north through the Bronx and into Westchester, to a neighborhood where the houses sat back from the street behind lawns that took real money to maintain. The Cadillac turned into a driveway, and the man got out and walked to his front door with the unhurried confidence of someone who has never once looked over his shoulder and found anything there. Illinois drove back to Harlem and found Bumpy sitting up in bed, a notepad on his knee. The handwriting near the bottom of the page noticeably harder to read than the handwriting at the top. "I found him." Bumpy set the notepad aside. "Where does he go alone?" That was the only question. Not who is he, or how many people protect him, or what will happen if this goes wrong. Just where does he go alone? Because Bumpy had already worked through every other question and arrived at the only one that still needed answering. Illinois described the hardware store in the Bronx. Sunday evenings. The man returned alone to review his books. The store was closed. The rear parking area was private. The neighborhood was quiet on Sunday evenings in a way that suggested the kind of emptiness that swallows sound. "Sunday," Bumpy said, not a question. Sunday evening arrived cold and clear. Bumpy was moving on medication and will in roughly equal measure, his breathing still labored but functional, the deep cough present but controlled. They parked a block from the store and watched the Cadillac turn into the rear lot, watched the light come on in the second-floor office window, watched the neighborhood settle into its Sunday quiet. "Eddie, watch the street," Bumpy said. "2 whistles if anyone comes. Illinois." "With me." The rear door was unlocked. Cross had left it that way because he was a man who had operated without consequences for 8 years and had gradually, without noticing it, stopped imagining that consequences were a real category of experience that applied to him. They went up the stairs without sound. The way Bumpy moved through everything with complete economy. Nothing wasted. Each step placed with the precision of a man who understood that silence was not the absence of noise but the presence of control. The office door was open. Cross sat at his desk with his back partially to the door, a calculator in his hand. Papers spread across the surface in front of him. A cup of coffee still producing a thin thread of steam beside his elbow. He was making small notations in the margin of a ledger, with the absorbed focus of a man who is entirely inside a problem and entirely certain that the room around him is as he left it. Bumpy stepped into the doorway. He did not announce himself. He did not speak. He simply stood there in the shadow of the frame with the stillness that had unnerved people far more prepared for confrontation than Warden Cross, and waited. Cross felt it before he saw it, that specific disturbance in the atmosphere of a room that occurs when the room is no longer only yours. He looked up from the ledger. His eyes found Bumpy in the doorway, and in the space of 1 second, every layer of protection that 8 years of careful architecture had built around him became, very clearly, theoretical. "Don't move," Bumpy said. The same quiet voice, the voice that did not need volume because it had already accounted for every possible response to what it was saying. "Don't make a sound." Cross was a man who had built his entire existence on the management of other people's fear. He understood its mechanisms intimately, and so he recognized, with the particular clarity that comes from standing on the wrong side of an expertise you have spent years developing, that the man in his doorway was not performing composure. He simply was composed. There was no effort in it. There was no threat in his voice because the threat was not in his voice. It was in the absolute absence of any indication that the outcome of this moment was in question. For the first time in 8 years, Warden Cross had nothing to say. The gun came out, and Cross's hands went up, and Bumpy moved into the room with the unhurried efficiency of someone executing a plan that has already been completed in his mind. He directed Cross to stand, to move away from the desk, to step away from the telephone that sat within reaching distance. And Cross complied with each instruction with the mechanical obedience of a man whose decision-making capacity has been temporarily overridden by the recognition that every exit he would normally reach for is already closed. Then Cross found his voice, and what came out was the full inventory. Every name, every relationship, every layer of protection that he had spent 8 years assembling. The police captain in the Bronx who handled certain complaints in certain ways. The city official who had approved the adjusted patrol schedule on the night of the 14th. The judge whose rulings on certain property matters had consistently favored certain parties. Cross delivered these names with the instinct of a man who has always used information as currency, who has spent his entire career watching carefully held secrets function as the most reliable form of insurance available. Bumpy listened to every word without moving, without interrupting, without changing his expression in any way that would have given Cross a signal to read. He let the entire inventory complete itself. Then he said, quietly, almost gently, "You just told me exactly who's been protecting you." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. Cross had been afraid. Now he was doing the specific arithmetic of a man who has just understood that he handed his opponent a weapon while believing he was negotiating. The names he had offered as shields had become a map. Every person he had named was now a liability rather than a protection, because Bumpy Johnson now knew exactly where the architecture was load-bearing and exactly where to apply pressure. "That was very helpful," Bumpy said. "Stand up. We're going for a drive." They drove north through the Bronx in the Cadillac that Cross had chosen for what it communicated: permanence, consequence, the weight of a man who does not worry about his place in the order of things. Illinois drove. Bumpy sat beside Cross in the back seat with the particular stillness of a man who has already made his decision and is now simply moving through the steps that follow it. Cross tried several more approaches during the drive. He tried reasoning. He tried negotiation. He tried invoking the names he had already given up, as though repetition might restore their value. Bumpy said nothing to any of it. He simply watched the city move past the window and let Cross exhaust himself against a silence that had no give in it. The pier was dark. The Hudson moved beneath them with the indifferent authority of something that has been here far longer than any of the human calculations being made on its banks. The wind off the water was cold enough to think clearly in. Cross's shoes were wrong for a pier in March-polished leather that was never designed for wet wood, and there was something in that detail. The small wrongness of a man in the wrong shoes in the wrong place at the wrong hour. That completed the picture of exactly how far his world had shifted in the space of one Sunday evening. Bumpy made him kneel, and then, with the patience of a man who has been waiting for the right question, he asked it, not about the night of the 14th, not about the names already given, but about the future, the other targets, the next buildings on the list, the communities Cross had designated for the same treatment, the ongoing plan that the Lennox Lounge had been only the first chapter of. Cross talked. He talked the way people talk when they have run out of other options, when the performance of toughness has become too expensive to maintain, when the body's most fundamental instinct overrides everything that the mind has constructed to manage situations like this one. He gave names, addresses, timelines. He described a plan that extended well beyond Harlem to other neighborhoods in other boroughs, a systematic campaign against black economic independence designed to run for years. He described it with the detail of a man who had spent considerable time proud of what he had built. When he was finished, Bumpy reached into his coat. He produced a white hood, the symbol of everything Cross's organization had used for 2 decades to make entire communities understand that their safety was conditional, that their achievements could be erased, that the darkness held things their daylight existence had no protection against. Cross looked at it in Bumpy's hands, and something shifted in his face, the specific recognition of a man who is seeing, for the first time, the object from the other side. Not as a symbol of power, as a symbol of what power looks like when it is finally, completely reversed. Cross understood what was about to happen. His expression completed its long journey from authority to calculation to negotiation to pleading, and arrived at last at something that had no name in the vocabulary of men who have spent their lives never needing it. The Hudson moved below them, patient and dark and entirely indifferent. At 6:15 the following morning, a sanitation worker near Pier 57 stopped his truck and looked at the water and called the police. The body was face down, the white shirt visible against the dark surface of the river. On the chest, pinned carefully through the fabric, was a small piece of paper. The ink was still sharp and clear despite the water. 2 words, written in a hand that was steady and deliberate and utterly without decoration. By that afternoon, every person in Harlem knew what those 2 words said, and not one of them was surprised. The NYPD opened a formal investigation on the morning the body was recovered, and closed it 14 days later without a single charge filed. Not because the evidence was thin. Everyone in the department who looked at the file knew exactly what had happened and exactly who was responsible. The hood, the note, the timing, the connection to the Lennox Lounge fire that had been officially ruled accidental 4 days earlier. Every thread was visible to anyone willing to pull it. But pulling threads was the problem, because this particular fabric, when unraveled, would expose police officers who had adjusted patrol schedules on request, a fire marshal who had written accidental on a report he knew was wrong, and a network of institutional relationships that ran deep enough into the department itself that an honest investigation would become very quickly. An investigation of the investigators. The file was archived in 1959 and forgotten by everyone except the people who remembered, which in Harlem was everyone. The two newspapers continued to tell two different stories to two different Americas. And both stories were true in the way that parallel truths are true, not contradicting each other, but describing the same events from positions so far apart that the accounts barely seemed to share a subject. Page 14 called it a tragedy, mourned the loss of a beloved community institution, and moved on by the following Monday. The front page called it what it was, named the organization responsible, described the network Cross had built inside the city's institutions, and printed the two words from the note in full. White New York read one version and forgot it. Black New York read the other and added it to the long memory that communities build when the official record cannot be trusted to hold the truth on their behalf. Construction crews arrived at the burned shell of the Lennox lounge 6 weeks after the fire, and what they built was not a restoration. It was a statement made in materials that do not burn. Steel reinforcement in every load-bearing wall. Fire-resistant construction throughout. A sprinkler system that was rare enough in 1946 to attract comment from the building inspector, who had never seen one installed in a private establishment of this size. Multiple exits, each wide enough to handle a full crowd moving quickly. Each designed by an architect who had been given a single instruction by the man funding the project. Build it so that what happened cannot happen again. Every person on the construction crew, the architects, the engineers, the workers who poured the concrete and welded the steel was from the neighborhood. The money that Bumpy put into that building stayed in Harlem by design. Circulating through the community it was meant to serve. The same principle that had governed the original club, now expressed in the economics of its reconstruction. Bumpy never spoke publicly about what had happened on the pier. He did not need to. The neighborhood understood, and the neighborhood's understanding was the only verdict that had ever mattered to him. But something shifted in the months that followed, something quieter and more durable than any single act of justice. Black veterans began coming to him, not to join his operations, not looking for work in the underground economy, but asking a different kind of question. How do you hold what you build? How do you protect a community when the institutions designed to protect it are working against it? How do you organize people who have been taught their whole lives that organization itself is dangerous? Bumpy held small meetings in back rooms, and what he taught in those meetings was not crime but strategy, how power actually functions, where its pressure points are, how collective action creates leverage that individual action never can. Dignity is not given, he told them. In the direct, undecorated way, he said everything that mattered. It is kept. Some historians who have studied this period believe those meetings were the first organized expression of what would later become Harlem's civil rights infrastructure, not beginning with a speech or a march or a moment that cameras captured, but with a man lying in a bed with damaged lungs drawing network diagrams on a notepad and deciding that what his community needed was not rescue, but architecture. January 14, 1947. The Lennox Lounge reopened. 450 people filled a space designed for 250, and nobody measured the difference or cared. Dizzy Gillespie was on stage, and midway through the second set, he stopped playing and looked up toward the dark booth on the second floor where Bumpy sat, as he always sat, watching what he had built. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something true is about to be said. 237 people are in this room tonight, Gillespie said. Every single one of us should know why. The ovation that followed lasted 3 full minutes. People were on their feet, some of them crying, some of them shouting, all of them understanding that what they were applauding was not a performance but a fact, the fact of their own continued existence in a world that had tried, with careful planning and adequate resources, to end it. Bumpy did not stand, did not wave, did not acknowledge the room in any way except a single slow nod. barely perceptible from the floor. The gesture of a man who has completed a piece of work and requires no external confirmation of its quality. The organization that Cross had built did not dissolve after his death. It continued to exist, continued to recruit, continued to operate in other cities and other neighborhoods with the patient persistence of systems that survive the individuals who build them. But it never came back to Harlem. Not once in the 12 years the rebuilt Lennox Lounge operated, not in the decades that followed, and in the private meetings of that organization, for years afterward. The name Warden Cross was spoken the way cautionary tales are spoken. Not with reverence, but with the specific weight of a lesson that cost something to learn. There was a man who tried to burn Harlem. They found him in the river. Do not make his mistake. 4 days, 4 headlines, 2 completely different stories about the same 4 days in March 1946. And only one truth that survived, all of it intact. Fire can destroy a building. It can take $40,000 of lumber and steel and memory and reduce it to ash in under an hour. What it cannot touch, what no carefully planned campaign of destruction has ever successfully reached, is the determination of people who have decided, collectively and without reservation, that they are finished being afraid. That was what Bumpy Johnson built in Harlem. Not just the Lennox Lounge. Not just the network of veterans who became the seeds of something larger, but the living proof, written in the events of 4 days in March 1946, that the equation of power is never as fixed as the powerful need it to be. That a community which decides to hold what it has built will hold it. That dignity, once claimed, is not a gift that can be revoked. The Lennox Lounge stood until 1958, when it was closed not by fire or intimidation, but by the bureaucratic machinery of urban renewal, the polite, legal, publicly celebrated form of the same impulse that had sent 3 men with gasoline cans in the dark. The building was demolished in 1959. But the story it contained was already somewhere that demolition could not reach in the memory of the neighborhood. In the oral history, passed from grandparents to grandchildren. In the understanding that what happened in March 1946 was not an isolated incident, but a proof. A demonstration that the outcome of a confrontation between organized power and organized community is not predetermined. That one man who refuses to move can change the mathematics of an entire situation, and that some things, no matter how long or how carefully you plan the fire, simply will not burn.